in the Airbnb? Well, they get it through the fact that if the place that you rented out, the room is dirty or, I don't know, has problems, leaks, the roof leaks or something like that, you get a bad rating and then no one comes. So you have this kind of incentive to improve it. So, I mean, one thing to think about might be those kind of standards, right? In order to replace this localized community that we used to have that would enforce standards, you know, these tools of the internet might be a means to do that, right? The recognition that, okay, he's part of this community, we invested in him, he did this thing and he did great, we give him 5 stars, right? And that becomes his validation, right? That there's, you know, there may be tremendous platform for these kind of sharing economy platforms. There might be a tremendous potential for these sharing economy platforms to actually serve that function, where you don't need, you know, some regulatory agency monitoring everybody, but it actually happens through the crowd, through the collectivity and whatnot. So there's a potential for, you know, you can have this kind of supervisory function exercised through the rating systems that often the digital platforms enable.
If we can take maybe, are there any questions on the sister side? Any questions on your side? Yes.
Thank you very much for the very informative lecture. I learned a lot.
You're welcome.
I think you should have a degree now in Islamic financing.
No.
My question is, why do you think that we still, in most countries which practice Islamic financing, we have what they call, or what you call in lecture, the window, or the image, or the dressing, which is very true, because that's my experience. So, is it lack of knowledge? Is it lack of the standard procedures, tools, etc., etc.? Or is it the kind of fear of losing power on the masses? Because 80–90% of the population over the world are trying to make ends meet. And they are throughout their life they are in debt. So is it really about not expanding on this knowledge and delivering something that will serve more equality and justice, or it's just the desire to control the masses? Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question, really good question. And my answer to that is that the problem is when institutions are created, they take on a life of their own, and that they become very difficult to change, right? So you get used to doing something a certain way, and you do it that way because it works, it's worked in the past, and it's part of a whole network of institutions that in some sense they work, right? You know, there weren't banks in parts of the Middle East until British colonizers came and set them up, or French colonizers, or whoever, right? But once those institutions get established, they take on a life of their own. And they become second nature, right? I gave you the example of money before, right? We use money all the time. You cannot live in Canadian society unless you go off and hunt in the woods. You can't live in Canadian society without money. So we get so used to money and the way we use money, where money comes from, how we use it, how we exchange it, that we don't even think about it, right? But if you think about the fact that, wow, I can walk into this bakery down here and I can take this funny colored piece of plastic out of my wallet and hand it to them, and they're going to give me food? Like, you can imagine someone from another planet coming to that, or from a civilization that didn't have money, and they say that and they're like, wait, you just used that piece of plastic to get food? That's like a miracle. Like, how is that even possible, right? You know, like, we don't think about it because we're so used to it. So, the upshot of that is that institutions, like money, like banks, like governments, bureaucracies, right? They become ubiquitous. We take them for granted. And we start thinking, okay, this is the way the world works, right? Because we start, you know, it's not like there's some system out there that's kind of imposing its will on us. We're enacting the system because we become so used to it, right? And once those systems become ingrained, they take on a life of their own. They take on a kind of power that then becomes very difficult to change in the long run. But, again, as I said to this brother's question over here, I don't think change is impossible. I think it's just the imagination of our change, right? We just have to start thinking of things. If we think of them a little bit differently, we can actually change a lot. And from little incremental changes, that's where the big changes come from. So I think, before the Soviet Union fell in 1989, people said, this system is going to go on forever, right? It looked so massive. The state had so much power. The Communist Party in Russia, Soviet Union, had so much power. And people said, this is just the system, It's gone like this. We had Lenin. We've had this for decades. It's going to go on into the future. And that was a story they kept telling themselves. And then all of a sudden, you have this small change. Gorbachev comes in. You have these other small changes. And then suddenly the Berlin Wall falls. And then suddenly the Soviet Union collapses. And no one had any idea that this was going to take place. I mean, the most powerful institutions in the world, the CIA, had no idea. You think the CIA is powerful? They had no idea that the Berlin Wall was going to come down. They had no idea that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And yet, and the people living in the Soviet Union had no idea that the Soviet Union was collapsed. And then in historical terms, the blink of an eye, the whole system just transformed into something else. So I think, often these institutions, the systems, they take on lives of their own, but there are vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities come from small-scale changes that then cascade into much larger changes. A lot of questions now. How about this brother back here?
So it's linked to this same question. In the Malaysian experience, for example, since you said that the Islamic banks, are still in this window dressing system because of the central banking, mechanism, the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
Is this because the central bank is owned by foreign interests, and therefore Malaysians have to do it this way? Or is it because of a lack of political will to establish a central banking system that's compatible with the Islamic finance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and a good question. Well, here's something that will complicate that narrative. Yes, on the one hand, for sure, central banks are part of networks, of other central banks. There are many ways. I don't think that there's one central bank that controls everything. I don't actually think that's the way it works. I think it works through these networks, right? That these networks become interconnected, and that because these networks are interconnected, it becomes very hard to disable the nodes, right? So I think the central bank, you're right, it has political investments, it has political interests. But at the end of the day, the interesting thing for me is that the central bank is actually promoting the very critique of actually existing Islamic finance that I just presented to you, right? It's a central bank that is investing the money in the research, in the education, to really rethink what debt-based Islamic finance would look like, what equity-based Islamic finance might become in the future, right? So I think it's maybe a bit more complicated than that, right? That I think there's a recognition that there are I think people in the central bank themselves are aware of these critiques, of the window dressing critiques, of the Islamic, and that's why they're promoting this critique. They're investing in the knowledge, they're investing in the brain power to actually create the critique to redress some of the problems that people are aware of in the system. I'll give you another example here. In many of the rulings, the Central Bank of Malaysia, Bank Negara, has a Sharia advisory board. And they issue fatwa about questions in Islamic finance, interpretations of fiqh, interpretations of Sharia. If you read through these fatwa, it's very interesting. Because in many of them they say, well, we're going to do this system, but we recognize this contract, say for example the Al-Iman, is permissible. But only in the short term to get the system started. And we recognize that maybe in the long term this isn't the right contract and that it won't work, but we're gonna make it halal in the short term because for purely pragmatic reasons. We need to get this industry off the ground, and this is the only way we can do it right now. But what that interpretation suggests is that the fatwa is not a final fatwa. That the question is not settled. That this is a question that may have to be revisited in the long run until we come up with a better solution. Maybe some of you sitting in this room are going to come up with a better solution, right? So I think that's puts a little bit more complex light on, well, it's just systems of power out there. No, it's more complex than that, right? That these things, yes, there are networks, yes, central banks are enmeshed in them, but my sense of the folks, the people that I interviewed, that I spent time with in the Malaysian Central Bank, they were aware of this, they were aware that the system wasn't perfect, and they would say things like, look, conventional banking, 500 years. They have 500 years of history to figure out how to make this system work as well as it does. And then to create people who disrupt it and make it not work when the crisis happens. But, Islamic banking, you're basically looking at 30 years of trying to create modern Islamic finance. And so that's not, something that happens overnight. The old adage is Rome wasn't built in a day. I think Islamic finance is not going to be built in a day either. I think we're looking at a project, we have to start thinking in time horizons of, probably decades before